Maya Reeves had
Good.
always
Now,
been the
phrase
kind
it
of
with more
person who made
dynamics.
herself small.
this?
Not
Yes,
because she
perfect.
lacked
Now add the
confidence in
crescendo.
who she was, but because she had learned, over many years, that the world was quieter and safer when she did not take up too much space. She spoke softly, laughed quietly, and rarely drew attention to herself in any room she entered. She had grown up in a modest house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, where her mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry and her father had left when Maya was 7 years old. There was not much money, not much noise, and not much excess of anything, except for one old upright piano that sat against the living room wall, slightly out of tune and covered in small scratches, but still capable of making the most beautiful sound Maya had ever heard in her life. She started playing when she was 5 years old, pressing the keys with one finger at first, picking out the melody of a song she had heard on television. Her mother noticed immediately and found a neighbor,
Yes,
an older
perfect.
retired music teacher named Mrs.
Good. Now,
Fontaine,
phrase
who
it with
agreed
more
to give Maya
dynamics.
lessons every
this?
Saturday morning
Yes,
in
perfect.
exchange
Now
for
add the
help with
crescendo.
grocery shopping. It was a simple arrangement, but it changed everything. By the time Maya was 10, she could play pieces that made Mrs. Fontaine close her eyes and press her hand to her chest. By the time she was 14, she had won 2 regional youth competitions and played in front of audiences that left her shaking with joy afterward. Music was not just something she did. It was the most honest version of herself she had ever found. But life has a way of complicating the things that bring people peace. When Maya was 16, her mother remarried a man named Gerald Whitman. Gerald was not cruel in an obvious way. He paid the bills, kept the house in order, and rarely raised his voice. But he had a particular way of looking at people that made them feel like they were an inconvenience. And he had very specific ideas about what was practical and what was a waste of
this?
time. The
Yes,
piano
perfect.
fell firmly into the second category as far
Good.
as
Now,
Gerald was
phrase it with more
concerned.
dynamics.
He tolerated
this?
it the way
Yes,
someone
perfect.
tolerates
Now
a
add
piece
the
of
crescendo.
furniture they did not choose, but cannot be bothered to remove. He never encouraged Maya, never asked about her playing, and on more than one occasion referred to her interest in music as a little hobby in conversations with his friends. Maya learned to practice when Gerald was out of the house. When Maya turned 22, she had managed to put herself through 2 years of a music education program at a state college, balancing classes with a part-time job at a coffee shop downtown. She was not wealthy. She did not have connections or a famous teacher or a grand instrument at home. What she had was discipline and love for her craft, and those 2 things had carried her further than most people around her expected. She had applied for a position as a part-time music instructor at the Whitmore Community Arts Center, a well-funded private program in the city that served both children and
Yes,
adult
perfect.
learners. The position was modest,
Good.
but
Now,
it came with
phrase it more
access to a
dynamics.
beautiful concert
this?
grand piano
Yes,
in the main
perfect.
hall,
Now add the
and that
crescendo.
alone made Maya want the job with everything she had. The Arts Center held a small mixer event for new applicants and current staff members before the hiring decisions were finalized. It was meant to be a relaxed gathering, a chance for people to meet and talk in an informal setting before the formal interviews took place. Maya arrived in a navy blue dress she had bought secondhand and pressed carefully the night before. She was nervous but focused, and she reminded herself quietly before walking through the door that she had earned her right to be in that room. That was where she first encountered Daniel Price. Daniel was the head of the music faculty at Whitmore, a man in his mid-40s with a reputation for producing exceptional students and an equally well-known reputation for being difficult to impress. He had a smooth, confident manner of speaking that suggested he had never spent much time doubting himself. And he moved through the
Good.
room at the
Now,
mixer
phrase it
with the
with more
ease of
dynamics.
someone who considered it
this?
his
Yes,
natural
perfect.
environment.
Now add the
Maya
crescendo.
was introduced to him by one of the program coordinators, a kind woman named Sandra who had reviewed Maya's application and seemed genuinely enthusiastic about her background. Daniel looked at Maya the way someone looks at an item on a menu they have already decided not to order. He shook her hand briefly, glanced at the simple resume Sandra held out toward him, and then said in front of 3 other staff members who were standing close enough to hear every word that the program was looking for candidates with conservatory training or professional performance experience, and that community college coursework was, in his words, a starting point at best. He smiled when he said it, which somehow made it worse. There was no anger in his voice, no obvious malice, just a casual certainty that Maya was not quite enough, delivered in front of people she had hoped to impress. The room did not go silent, but it might as well have. Sandra looked uncomfortable.
Good.
The
Now,
other staff
phrase it with
members
more
shifted
dynamics.
slightly.
Like this?
Maya felt the heat
Yes,
rise in her
perfect. Now
face,
add
and
the
she kept her
crescendo.
expression steady through what felt like enormous effort. She thanked him politely, said it was nice to meet him, and excused herself to find a glass of water. She stood near the window for a moment, breathing slowly, and she made a quiet decision that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the years she had spent at that old scratch piano when no one was watching. Maya did not sleep well that night. She lay in her small apartment with the window cracked open and the sounds of the street below drifting in, and she replayed the moment over and over in her mind. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet determination that had always lived somewhere deep inside her. She had heard dismissal before. She had heard it from Gerald, from teachers who thought she was dreaming too big, from people who looked at her background and decided the story before she had a chance to tell it herself. What Daniel Price had done at that mixer was not new. It was simply the latest version of something she had been living with for a long time, and she had learned that the best response to that kind of dismissal was never an argument. It was proof. The formal interview process at Whitmore involved 2 stages. The first was a panel conversation with 3 members of the faculty, including Daniel. The second, for candidates who advanced, was a live teaching demonstration in front of a small group of students. Maya had prepared thoroughly for both. She had written out her teaching philosophy, practiced answering questions about curriculum and student development, and thought carefully about how she would present herself with confidence without coming across as someone trying too hard to prove a point. She walked into the panel interview the following Thursday morning with her materials organized and her hands steady. Daniel sat at the center of the table. He was professional during the interview, asking questions in a measured tone and taking notes without much expression. But there were moments where his skepticism surfaced in subtle ways. When Maya spoke about her experience teaching beginner students privately and at a community center during college, he asked whether she had ever worked with students at an advanced level, with a slight emphasis on the word advanced that made the question feel more like a challenge than a genuine inquiry. When she described her own performance background, including her regional competition wins as a teenager and a recital she had performed the previous year, he nodded slowly in the way people nod when they are being polite rather than persuaded. Maya answered every question clearly and directly. She did not shrink, and she did not over-explain herself. When the panel thanked her and told her she would hear back within a week, she left the room feeling that she had done everything she could in that format. The rest was out of her hands. 3 days later, Sandra called to tell her she had advanced to the demonstration round. The teaching demonstration was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in the main hall of the Arts Center. It was the room with the concert grand, a Steinway Model D that Maya had noticed on her first visit and had not been able to stop thinking about since. The setup was simple. Each candidate would have 30 minutes with a small group of 4 students ranging in age and skill level, and the faculty panel would observe from chairs positioned a short distance away. It was designed to show how a candidate communicated, how they read a student's needs, and how they handled the unexpected. Maya arrived early. She asked the coordinator if she could have 10 minutes alone in the room before the students arrived, and the coordinator agreed. She sat down at the Steinway, placed her hands lightly on the keys without pressing them, and breathed. She had played on many instruments over the years, some far less cooperative than others, and she had a habit of taking a moment to simply feel the instrument before asking anything of it. She played a few quiet scales, adjusted her posture, and then sat in stillness before the door opened and the students began to file in. The 30 minutes that followed were some of the most natural Maya had ever spent in a professional setting. The students included a 10-year-old boy who had been playing for 2 years and was frustrated that his hands could not yet do what his ears imagined. A teenage girl who was technically precise but played without any feeling. An adult woman in her 40s who was a complete beginner and visibly nervous about embarrassing herself. And a 16-year-old boy who was advanced enough to be bored by standard instruction and made sure everyone in the room could sense it. It was a carefully chosen mix, and Maya understood immediately that the challenge was not just to teach, but to make each of those 4 very different people feel seen at the same time. She moved between them with an ease that surprised even herself. She sat beside the 10-year-old and showed him a way of thinking about his left hand that made his eyes widen with sudden understanding. She asked the teenage girl to close her eyes and just listen to what the phrase was asking for before she played it. And when the girl tried again, the difference was audible enough that one of the observing faculty members leaned forward slightly in their chair. With the nervous adult woman, Maya was so warm and unhurried that the woman's shoulders visibly dropped from around her ears within 5 minutes. And with the bored 16-year-old, she challenged him directly but respectfully, asking him to play a passage, and then showing him 3 different ways the same passage could be interpreted depending on what the performer chose to communicate. He did not look bored after that. Daniel sat in his chair with his notepad and watched all of it. With about 4 minutes remaining in the session, Sandra quietly approached Maya and leaned in to say that the panel would like to hear Maya play something herself if she was willing. It was not a standard part of the process, Sandra clarified, just an optional addition that some candidates chose to include. Maya nodded, settled the students in their seats, and turned back to the Steinway. She chose a Chopin nocturne she had been playing since she was 17. It was not the most technically demanding piece in her repertoire, but it was the one she felt most completely when she played it, and feeling was what the moment called for. She did not perform it the way someone performs for a panel. She played it the way she played alone at home, with full honesty, letting every phrase breathe and every silence carry its own weight. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment before the students began to clap. Maya looked up and let her eyes move briefly to the panel. Sandra was smiling openly. The other two faculty members were nodding with genuine appreciation. Daniel Price was not writing on his notepad. He was simply looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that sat between surprise and recognition, and his pen was resting still in his hand. Maya thanked the students, gathered her things with quiet composure, and walked out of that room knowing something had shifted. The offer came 4 days later in an email from Sandra, and it was better than the original posting had described. The role included more hours, a slightly higher rate, and a note that the panel had been unanimous in their decision. Maya read the email twice at her kitchen table, then set her phone down and sat with it for a moment before calling her mother. Her mother cried a little on the phone, the quiet kind of crying that comes not from sadness but from relief. The kind that says, "I always knew, but I was also always afraid." Maya told her not to cry and then cried a little herself, and they laughed about it afterward the way people laugh when something good finally arrives after a long wait. The first few weeks at Whitmore were an adjustment. Maya was new, and the environment was polished in ways that her previous experience had not fully prepared her for. The parents of the students were often accomplished people, with strong opinions about their children's progress and clear expectations about what results should look like. The other instructors had credentials from well-regarded institutions and the easy confidence that tends to come with years of operating in respected spaces. Maya was aware that she was still proving herself in the daily, ordinary way that new people always have to, and she approached each lesson with the same care and preparation she had brought to the demonstration. Daniel was professional with her. Not warm, not particularly engaging, but professional. He acknowledged her in hallways, reviewed her initial lesson plans without major criticism, and left her largely to her work. Maya did not expect friendship from him and did not seek it. She had not come to Whitmore to repair a relationship with someone who had dismissed her. She had come to teach, and that was where she placed her energy. Her students responded to her in the way that students respond to teachers who genuinely care about them. There was a 12-year-old named Priya who had been told by a previous instructor that she lacked natural ability, and who arrived at her first lesson with Maya already half convinced that the assessment was correct. Within 3 weeks, Priya was playing with a focus and a small growing confidence that her mother noticed and mentioned to Sandra, who passed the comment along to Maya with a warm smile. There was an older teenager named Marcus who wanted to write his own music, but had never been given the tools or the permission to try, and Maya spent part of each of his lessons giving him both. There were beginners who arrived terrified and left feeling capable, and intermediate students who arrived comfortable and left feeling challenged. Maya poured herself into each of them, and the work was the most fulfilling she had done in her professional life. About 6 weeks into the position, Whitmore began preparing for its annual showcase, an evening concert that featured both student performances and a short set by one or two of the faculty members. It was a significant event for the center, attended by donors, parents, community members, and occasionally local press. Sandra mentioned to Maya during a planning meeting that the faculty had traditionally included one or two newer instructors in the performance segment as a way of introducing them to the broader community, and that Daniel would be making the selections for that year. Maya did not put her name forward. She was not the kind of person who campaigned for visibility or angled for recognition. She kept doing her work and let the decision belong to whoever was making it. If she was selected, she would be grateful. If she was not, she would be in the audience cheering for whoever was. 2 weeks before the showcase, Daniel stopped by the doorway of the practice room where Maya was finishing up with a student. He waited until the student had gathered her things and left, and then he stepped inside. He stood near the door rather than coming fully into the room, which gave the moment a particular quality, like a man who had something to say but had not yet decided how much space to give it. He told her, with a directness that contained no warmth but also no condescension, that he had selected her to perform a solo piece at the showcase. He said the panel had agreed she was the right choice. He started to turn to leave and then paused, and what he said next was delivered quietly, without drama or ceremony. He said that he had underestimated her at the mixer, and that he wanted her to know he recognized that. He did not wait for a response. He simply nodded once and walked out. Maya stood in the empty practice room for a long moment. She thought about the mixer, about the way those words had landed in front of people she did not yet know. She thought about the nights of practice that no one had ever witnessed, about Mrs. Fontaine pressing her hand to her chest, about the old scratch piano in her mother's living room. She thought about Gerald referring to her music as a little hobby in conversations with his friends, and about the regional competitions where she had walked onto stages far bigger than anyone around her had expected her to reach. She thought about all of it, and then she let it settle into something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite victory, but was somewhere honest between the two.
Like this?
Then she
Yes,
sat down at the
perfect.
upright in the corner of the practice room, placed her hands on the keys, and began to work on what she would play at the showcase. Not to make a point, not to settle a score, but because music had always been the truest thing she knew how to offer, and this time she would offer it in a room full of people who had chosen her to be there. She played until the room grew dark around her, and she did not notice until someone knocked gently on the door to let her know the building was closing. She gathered her things, thanked the staff member at the door, and walked out into the cool evening air feeling something she had not felt in a long time. She felt ready. The night of the showcase arrived cool and clear. The main hall at Whitmore had been arranged with careful attention, rows of chairs set in clean arcs around the stage, soft warm lighting that made the Steinway at the center look like something placed there by intention rather than logistics. Fresh flowers sat on a table near the entrance, and the air inside carried that particular feeling of a room that has been prepared for something worth preparing for. Families arrived in groups, donors greeted each other near the back, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the space gradually until there was not an empty seat visible from where Maya stood at the side of the stage. She was not nervous in the way she had expected to be. There was a steadiness in her that had been building for weeks, fed by the work she had done with her students and the hours she had spent alone at the piano working on what she would play. She watched the student performances from the wings with genuine attention, recognizing in each one the particular kind of courage it takes to play something you have worked hard on in front of people whose opinion matters to you. When Priya walked onto the stage and played her piece cleanly, and with a confidence that had not existed in her 2 months earlier, Maya pressed her hand briefly to her own chest the way Mrs. Fontaine used to do, and felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with herself. When Sandra stepped to the microphone to introduce Maya, the description she gave was warm and specific. She spoke about Maya's background, her years of study, her regional competition history, and the impact she had already made on her students in just a few weeks at the center. Maya heard her own story told back to her by someone who had taken the time to understand it, and the experience was more moving than she had anticipated. She walked to the piano with the same steadiness she had brought to every room she had ever entered that had tried to make her feel like she did not belong. She began with the Chopin Nocturne. It was the piece she had played at the end of her teaching demonstration, and she had chosen to open with it deliberately, not as a callback, but because it was the piece that told the most honest version of who she was as a musician. She played it the way she always played it when she was alone, with complete attention and no performance of effort, letting the music exist on its own terms rather than pushing it toward any effect. The room was very still. She could feel the quality of the silence, the way it was being held rather than simply present, and that kind of silence is something musicians learn to recognize as the highest form of attention an audience can give. When the nocturne ended, she did not pause for applause. She moved directly into the second piece, and the transition between the two was smooth enough that the audience understood they were being asked to stay in the experience rather than step out of it. The second piece was her own. She had been writing it in small sections over several years, adding to it the way people add to something they are not yet ready to finish, and she had completed it in the weeks leading up to the showcase. It was not a dramatic composition in the way that some original works announce themselves. It was layered and quiet at the start, built on a simple phrase that repeated and shifted and grew in meaning each time it returned, the way certain experiences in life take on new weight as more time passes around them. The music moved through everything she had carried. It did not name any of it directly, because music does not work that way, but anyone listening closely could sense that the person playing had lived inside something difficult and had found a way through it that did not require bitterness. There was grief in certain passages and there was joy in others, and there were moments where the two existed at the same time in a way that felt completely true. When the final phrase arrived and resolved, it did so gently, without force, the way things resolve when they have been given enough time and enough honesty. The applause that followed started before she had fully lifted her hands from the keys. It was the kind that surprises the people giving it, coming from somewhere instinctive rather than considered. Maya sat for just a moment before she stood, and in that moment she looked out at the room with clear eyes. Daniel Price was seated in the third row. She found him without looking for him. He was clapping steadily with everyone else, but what caught her attention was the way he was sitting. His shoulders were not pulled back in the composed, authoritative posture she had seen from him in every other setting. They were dropped slightly, naturally, and his head was lowered just enough to suggest that something in him had been asked to be quiet and had listened. There was no performance in it. It was simply a man in a room who had heard something that required him to reconsider, and he was doing that privately and without announcement. Maya did not feel triumph when she saw him. She had not played to reach that moment, and so the moment did not belong to her in the way a victory belongs to someone who fought for it. What she felt was something quieter and more permanent. She felt like a person who had spent years becoming ready for a room like this one, and who had finally walked into it on her own terms, carrying everything she had been given and everything she had built, and had offered it honestly to people who were willing to receive it. She acknowledged the audience with a simple nod, the way Mrs. Fontaine had always told her to, with gratitude and without excess, and then she walked off the stage. Her mother was waiting near the side door with her coat still on and her eyes already full. Maya walked straight to her and they held onto each other for a moment without saying anything, because nothing they could have said would have added to what was already there. Outside the tall windows of the hall, the city moved on in its ordinary way, indifferent and continuous. And inside, in the warm light, something that had been a long time coming had finally and quietly arrived. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.